Welcome to Intellectual and Developmental Disability in Child Welfare. This lecture is a collaboration between Molly Hudkins, Rochelle Jewell, and Jenny Westbrook. To analyze the relationship between intellectual and developmental disabilities, also referred to as IDD, and the child welfare system, we must first understand how each is defined individually. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the term developmental disability refers to a group of conditions that are due to impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. The CDC suggests that these types of disabilities occur in about 1 in every 6 children. In a comprehensive guide to intellectual and developmental disabilities, Brown and Percy define those with developmental disability as people whose intellectual capacities, communication skills, and/or behavior areas are determined to be developing or to have developed at a slower rate or to a lesser extent than what is deemed to be normal. Recently, in the United States, we have been transitioning to use the term intellectual disability. This is because it focuses on external barriers rather than the presumed developmental struggles that a person with IDD may experience. When addressing child welfare, the social services field most often refers to abuse and neglect, and the child protective services involved with these issues. The Child Welfare Information Gateway, part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, discusses issues of abuse and neglect as they relate to child welfare. They define abuse and neglect as any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents imminent risk of serious harm. When it is discovered that a child has experienced abuse or neglect, he or she may be placed under protective services or out-of-home placements, such as foster care, group homes, or residential facilities. While IDD and child welfare are uniquely complex issues, it is important to address their intricate relationship. Let's look at the prevalence of children with IDD in the child welfare system. Unfortunately, there is no doubt that children diagnosed with an IDD are at an increased risk of experiencing abuse and neglect. Exact numbers are difficult to come by, however, because of the deficiencies in the systems which track these diagnoses. We find a wide range of statistical rates reported for the occurrence of IDD in child welfare. In a 2011 study by Lightfoot et al., they found that children with an intellectual or developmental disability are 3 times more likely to suffer from abuse and neglect than children without a disability. According to the Brun study of 2003, it is also believed that anywhere between 11.5% and 61% of individuals with an IDD experience some form of abuse and neglect during childhood. According to Brun in the 2001 study, the United States recorded approximately 4,185,627 children with between the ages of 5 and 20 who had a disability. Of these, somewhere between 492,000 and 1,553,800 children also had reports of abuse and neglect. Brun went on to report that within the child welfare system, about 53% of children experience cognitive disabilities, and between 26% and 45% have some sort of physical disability. Iverson et al., in their 2010 study, found that 12% of children in the child welfare system had learning disabilities, compared to only 0.4% of children who were not linked with the child welfare system. It is clear from research that there is a connection between IDD and the child welfare system. However, the range of data suggests need for further clarification about this association. As noted, there is a large range of reported rates of IDD in the child welfare system. It becomes important then to explore the reasons why such varied data may exist. One reason for this discrepancy is that IDD is often undiagnosed. In addition, those with diagnoses often go unreported to Child Protective Services. Children may be labeled as having a disability, but have never been given a proper assessment or diagnosis by a trained professional. This is a result of another dilemma when it comes to tracking rates of IDD, and that is the lack of properly trained CPS workers in the field. CPS being Child Protective Service workers. Brunn suggested that many child welfare employees are not trained in the intricacies of IDD diagnoses, and thus are not able to identify these children within the system. Shannon and Aragasto reported that in 2006, only 20 states offered IDD training for their CPS workers. Finally, there is no standard format for gathering data from each state. Until very recently, there were no federal requirements for reporting cases involving a child with an IDD. The combination of these barriers makes it very difficult for children to be identified as having an intellectual or developmental disabilities. Also for agencies to report accurate numbers, and for children to receive the appropriate attention and services they deserve within the child welfare system. Possibly even more importantly to address are the reasons why children with IDD experience greater rates of abuse and neglect. First of all, family structure and circumstances play an important role in child welfare. Families who have a child with an IDD often have lower household income, lower education, and increased rates of single parenthood. All of these things put them at a higher risk for CPS involvement. Children with IDD are often seen as objects as well, rather than people of value, and are sometimes described as disruptive to normal family dynamics. These misunderstandings about children with IDD may lead to a child's communication skills being more limited than they would normally be, and there may be an increase in what are considered to be problem behaviors as a result. These variables also increase a child's risk for abuse and neglect, and thus the likelihood that they will experience more time in the child welfare system. In practice, when working with individuals who have an IDD, it is necessary for social workers to take a special approach with clients. One unique issue that may arise from workers, or for workers rather, is communication with a client who has an IDD. Lightfoot et al. Discussed challenges that communication barriers present for children with an IDD. This challenge affects the social workers as well. If a child has limited verbal skills, he or she may not be able to communicate any maltreatment they are experiencing. Social workers must use creative means to effectively assess and question children with IDD to provide them with the best support possible. A social worker might rely on things like technology, art, or sign language in order to communicate effectively with a child. It is the hope that by incorporating these unique strategies in the social work field, we can help to protect children with IDD better. From a larger systems perspective, social workers often play the role of advocate and collaborator, both of which can be complicated by the unique needs of an individual with an IDD. According to Mason, because of the complex challenges faced, it is imperative that children in the child welfare system who have an IDD have an advocate and can coordinate care between CPS, the school system, and healthcare providers. The lack of effective policies and the underreporting of IDD, however, makes this a very difficult task for social workers. We see an example of this lies within the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which prevents early intervention practices for children without the permission of their biological parent. This is especially difficult in the child welfare system when a child is placed out of home and the biological parents are not available. Social workers could benefit from advocating on a macro level for adaptation of such policies, and also within the school systems to promote proper inclusion and supports to help reduce the negative effects of child abuse and neglect. Research suggests that there is a great need for diagnosing and connecting individuals with services. The child welfare field also requires a substantial increase in training surrounding the identification and support of IDD. Historically, the lack of understanding about IDD has led to inappropriate decisions about placement and treatment, and this has also led to conditions within the child welfare system that are detrimental to the very children it serves. In the 2014 article, Children with Disabilities and Poverty, Mason reminds his readers that the protection of a child is the responsibility of all parties involved, and not simply the responsibility of one particular agency. This is why the field could benefit from increasing training and knowledge of CPS workers to help identify, connect, and support families who have children with IDD. Abuse and neglect prevention efforts make up a large portion of the services and supports provided to children with IDD as well as their peers. Child Welfare Services attempts to implement prevention efforts that touch every aspect of a child's life: the child, their family, workers, community, and society as a whole. According to the Child Welfare Information Gateway, prevention efforts include increasing a child's education, social inclusion, and communication skills, as well as providing respite services and support groups for parents, strengthening parent-child bonding, improving training and staff ratios for workers, and helping society as a whole to view children with IDD as unique, valuable individuals worthy of being treated with kindness and equality. Treatment services and support are limited and largely involve some aspect of parent education rather than services for the child who has experienced maltreatment. The Child Welfare Information Gateway describes two categories of services after a child becomes a victim of maltreatment. These are in-home services and out-of-home services. The Child Welfare Services determine which avenue to take based on the severity and level of risk associated with the abuse and/or neglect. Children are allowed to stay with their caregivers and are provided with in-home services such as therapy or counseling, parent training, and education, safety planning, and connection with services that provide basic needs such as food or shelter when there is a low risk involved. In more severe cases where the child is at greater risk, children are removed from their home, from their caregivers, and are provided with foster care, group home, or residential services, while their caregiver goes through education and training to help prevent future abuse or neglect. Unfortunately, even with these efforts, children are not always reunified with their families. There is a severe lack of evidence-based treatment for children with IDD who have been abused or neglected. This might result from the widespread movement to be more proactive rather than reactive, and to focus efforts on prevention of abuse and neglect rather than supporting a child following the maltreatment. The current accepted best practice appears to be referral to a professional who has experience working with children with IDD, though that can be difficult to come by. Additionally, it doesn't guarantee best treatment, as not all professionals with experience working with children with IDD have proper training related to the intricacies of abuse and neglect. In 2004, the Kauffman Foundation reviewed a wide range of evidence-based treatments for typically functioning children and found abuse-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, to be one of the best practices. While there is a wealth of knowledge surrounding evidence-based practices for typically functioning children, little addresses how children with IDD might require treatment different from what is considered best practice for their peers. The way in which a community views a child with IDD can have a great impact on how that child is treated within the community, especially if the community is not accepting of the child, or of IDD in general. The positivity or negativity of these beliefs can also impact a child's likelihood of being abused, neglected, or maltreated, which in turn impacts their likelihood of becoming involved with CPS. For example, a community might think that a child with an IDD is unworthy of the same educational or social opportunities as their peers. The community might believe or devalue their talents or contributions. They might believe that children with IDD are incapable of feeling pain. These are the kinds of beliefs that can lead to social separation, feelings of shame or worthlessness for the child. They can also lead to the community coming to see maltreatment as acceptable the longer that these kind of beliefs go on. The 1948 United Nations International Declaration of Human Rights states, "The right to live free from fear and from want is a basic human right. The UN further specifically extends these rights to individuals with disabilities through several other conventions, including the Convention of the Rights of the Child of 1989. This states that every child has the right to live free from abuse. Article 23 of this convention additionally guarantees that children living with IDD also have the right to be free from maltreatment, and it requires states to create policy and enforce this basic human right. The Constitution of the United States also guarantees that people living with IDD share the same rights as other citizens. While the child welfare system is intended to support the needs of all children in crisis, it is not effectively serving the needs of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Federal and state policies do provide requirements to support children with disabilities at a local level, but there is little guidance offered about how to accomplish this. CPS workers often find children with disabilities difficult to place. Providers of foster care may be reluctant to take in a child with disabilities for fear that their needs will be difficult to meet. Many of these children get placed in group homes as a result. When children with IDD are placed in homes, foster families often are not given enough information about their child with IDD prior to placement and do not have adequate follow-up services. There is a general lack of collaboration between providers and minimal use of multidisciplinary approaches to serve the diverse needs of children with IDD in the child welfare system. There are also significant gaps in the delivery of services to children with disabilities in relationship to the guidelines of the services that should be delivered as required by IDEA. While initiatives are intended to guarantee the support of individuals with IDD, there is not effective infrastructure to incorporate best practices in this field when it comes to serving children in the need of child protective services. There are several barriers to children with IDD in the child welfare system receiving the specialized services they need and have a right to. Even though CPS workers believe that the majority of children entering the child welfare system have some type of disability, they are not trained in the field of disability and thus are not qualified to make assessments regarding disability services. There aren't accurate screening processes to either determine or record the disability for follow-up either. Most CPS staff are not even qualified to conduct effective interviews for children with IDD. Due to communication challenges, intake interviews can be both challenging and incomplete. In addition, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, better known as HIPAA, makes it difficult to gather information about children from outside sources. Because disability is viewed as a stressor on the family and is recognized as a risk factor, when children with IDD are placed in foster care, there is often not much effort put towards adoption or reunification with the families. As a result, while 32.5% of children referred to CPS were eligible for IDEA services, only 12.75% actually received those services. There have been efforts by states to support local child protective services, however. In the 2006 article Identifying Children with Developmental Disabilities Receiving Child Protective Services, a national survey of child welfare administrators, it was found that 13 states had a formal definition of developmental disability, which was provided to the child welfare systems in that state. Additionally, 20 states provided training for child welfare workers related to identifying IDD in children. Also, 34 states provided various types of assistance to their local protective service organizations. Unfortunately, there was no oversight to determine the success of these programs. While historically we have not met the needs of children with disabilities in our child welfare system, there appears to be a recent shift in the awareness to address this issue. In New York, for instance, over the past few years, there have been several organizations providing groundbreaking service to improve the practice. These include Interviewing Cares, which identifies challenges with interviewing maltreated children with IDD, and also provides methods for CPS workers to be more effective. Another method was Community of Learners to enhance the safety and success of children with disabilities. This encourages collaboration of professionals serving maltreated children with IDD. These organizations provide inspiration and confidence that our communities will continue to grow and become better prepared to support children with IDD and the CPS system, and also to be more self-sufficient and supported by families and their peers. While current policies work to protect and provide for children with IDD, there is still room for improvement in supports and services offered to them and their families. The first policy to promote would be a universal assessment and reporting process across all states that would help to improve tracking and treatment for individuals with IDD within the child welfare system. Huang suggested in 2012 that policies that allow for more support and funding in child care and school settings would provide parents peace of mind and ability to earn an income, and ultimately reduce their risk for maltreatment within the home. Policies that focus on interventions for at-risk families would help to prevent the maltreatment of children with IDD and lower the rate of those entering the child welfare system. And lastly, policies that require CPS workers to be trained in issues related to IDD are necessary, extremely necessary, to provide appropriate, effective supports for children with IDD who are experiencing abuse and neglect. In conclusion, it is extremely unfortunate that children with IDD experience greater rates of abuse and neglect than their peers without a disability. As a profession, social workers seek to determine why these types of injustices occur and determine how to more effectively address the needs of our most vulnerable clients. As social work practice is directly influenced by the unique issues related to IDD and child welfare, the profession would greatly benefit from addressing these specific issues. While current policies attempt to meet the needs of families experiencing both an IDD and abuse and neglect, there is certainly much more room for improvement in terms of training, prevention, and supports being provided.